My name is Stephen Fletcher. I'm a documentary filmmaker, but most of my working life I've been a computer programmer. For me, the love affair of the computer started at the age of 14 when I got my first computer, the VIC-20, closely followed by the Commodore 64 and then, of course, the Amiga. Now, 35 years later, I want to take you on a journey back to the birth of the home computer by following the Commodore story, discovering the origins and what led up to the Commodore 64 being the best ever selling computer in history. It's remarkable that in my lifetime, technology has advanced so much. From computers once the size of a room to mobile phones that fit in your pocket. You don't have to go back too many years and computers just didn't exist. But now we find computers filling every aspect of our lives. We will be traveling around Europe and across America, interviewing many legends from Commodore and Amiga.
$500,000, March 7th, 1984.
You invented something that changed my life.
And there's a bunch of Z8000 programmers, you know, looking like I just shot a sheep or something.
On the other side, rather than panicking because your ball grid array or something was inverted and there's nothing you can do about it.
A meeting with Jack Tramiel was often called a Jack attack.
Do you ever get a jump where it's 10 times better these days? No.
Welcome to RJ Michael's House of Construction.
We will also be attending Commodore and Amiga events, plus retro shows to see how alive the Commodore and Amiga scene is in today's modern world.
Arriving in San Francisco, we're going to be doing the Commodore Story documentary, and the first thing we see is from a museum, and it's all about the typewriter, and potentially the first chapter, the first part of the documentary we're going to call the Typewriter Man, because it's all about Jack Tramiel and where he came from, and here we are. Yeah, thanks a lot. Right, all together.
300 feet, turn right towards San Francisco.
My name's Leonard Tramiel, and I was involved in the personal computer industry for quite some time. I was on the team that developed the Commodore PET, and then actually went off to graduate school and didn't have any direct involvement in the VIC-20 or Commodore 64. Had some indirect work with some of the engineers and marketing folk, and of course with my dad. The way Commodore got into the computer business was completely by accident. So let's take a couple of historical steps back. My father, when he left the U.S. Army, had some experience repairing typewriters. He was trained to do that in the Army. And one of his first jobs after leaving was he got the contract to continue doing the typewriter repair for the Army base. And his business went from repairing typewriters to importing and selling typewriters. And then from typewriters into other office equipment like adding machines, and then from adding machines to electronic calculators.
This is where Commodore started. Jack Tramiel made these things and made his money with it.
Interesting story about this piece of equipment. Everybody knows that Jack Tramiel didn't have really a lot of interest in the computer business. He wanted to sell calculators like this one. And a lot of people will recognize this specific clicklet keyboard. And it was Chuck Peddle who engineered the first computer for Commodore. But because real keyboards were really expensive at the time, Jack Tramiel decided that this keyboard should be used.
Virtually every calculator was designed around a calculator chip produced by Texas Instruments. And our friends at TI decided that they wanted to get into the calculator business. So they produced calculators and sold them for roughly the cost that they were selling the calculator chip for, which drove everybody out of business. My father said, so he told this story a couple of times, and he said that in his mind, his reaction was, well, they can die, but I'm not going to die that easily. Being a Holocaust survivor, survival was an important thing for him. So he found a calculator chip company, or a company that made calculator chips. And it turned out they were not doing all that well financially, and bought them. And one of the projects that this company was involved in was a little thing that he knew nothing about called a microprocessor, the MOS technology 6502, which was probably the most used microprocessor of all time. All the Commodore machines in that series, the PET, VIC-20, Commodore 64, all of those, all of the Apple 8-bit machines, all of the Atari 8-bit machines, including the Atari Video Entertainment System, and the Nintendo machine, all use that same chip, which is really quite amazing. You know, how do you make it work? You've got to have some programming going along with it, needs to have some memory, needs to have some I/O. So Chuck designed the KIM, which keyboard interface module, if I remember correctly. And it had a 16-button keyboard that allowed you to enter commands, program the thing in assembly language, or actually in binary, in hexadecimal code. Lots of fun, because that's the way all programming should be done. And that was the first personal computer I ever used. I had a KIM in my bedroom.
MOS Technology was in Norristown, and I'd actually visited MOS Technology when I was in high school, and met Chuck Peddle and bought a KIM 1 directly from the factory. So Commodore, since they owned MOS Technology, I figured that was be a perfect fit for me. So when Neil gave me a call, I applied and got a job with the VIC-20 team, headed by Mike Tomchuk.
Chuck had designed the chip as a first step in a process where he wanted to make, and this is going to sound pretty funny, he wanted to make household robots a thing. So the first thing he needed was a really inexpensive microprocessor. And he met with my dad and said, I'm going to make this computer. If you want Commodore to make this computer, I'll work for you, and Commodore will make this computer. Dad said, okay, let me think about it. And he came home and spoke to me and said, I have no idea what he's talking about. Come meet this guy, talk to him about it, and tell me what you think. So this, punk kid at 20 goes to meet the designer of what is probably one of the most influential pieces of technology ever, Chuck Peddle, the designer of the 6502. And Chuck and I sit down in a booth at a embedded computer system fair, and they had as an example of a marvelous thing you could build with this, a pinball machine. And Chuck and I sit down to talk about computers, and we spent most of the time talking about science fiction. A science fiction story by Robert Heinlein called The Door into Summer, which is all about a world full of personal computers. And Chuck wanted to live in that world. So if no one else was going to make that world, he was going to do it. And the first step was the PET. So after the meeting, talked to Dad, and I said, this guy knows what he's talking about. And Commodore went into the computer business.
I joined Commodore in 1981 in the United Kingdom, despite this American accent.
My first computer was the Commodore VIC-20. I was 6 years old when I got that.
I managed to augment my meager savings, and we went out and bought a second-hand Commodore 64 for my birthday.
I got my first computer, home computer, which was the Commodore 64.
My first computer started with a Commodore 64.
I remember Christmas morning, 1988, I think it was. I unwrapped a Commodore Plus 4.
For me, my brand spanking new Commodore 64 computer, eager to go downstairs and play on it in the lounge. Unfortunately, being Christmas Day, there was a James Bond film on in the afternoon, and because we were a one TV family, I had to wait until that had finished.
We are here in Atlanta, Georgia, and my first computer was a Commodore 64.
I wrote a lot of music on the C64 back in the 80s.
I had a real synthesizer sound chip, the SID chip. I was like, besides myself, I had to have one.
I'm from that little window of people that worked for Jack Tramiel and then worked there after Jack Tramiel left. So I call this a Commodore a Greek tragedy in 3 acts, and I'm from Act 2, right in the middle of it.
Jack's past was known in the company, but not in great detail, at least not generally. I mean, people knew he'd been through a tough time in Germany and got his start in Toronto and so on, but it wasn't a topic of general conversation.
His experiences in the Second World War were rather horrific. So he often told the story of, I guess it was September 1st, 1939, when the Germans invaded Poland. He remembers seeing these squadrons of airplanes flying over, and he thought that was really cool, and he went outside and saluted. He didn't think all that highly of them after they came into town. Lodz was very close to the border, in fact so close that they wound up annexing that part of Poland into Germany. All the Jews were rounded up and sent to live in one particular section of the city called the ghetto. Conveniently not too far from the Jewish cemetery. And it was basically slave labor. I don't actually remember what Dad did during the ghetto years, but it would have been, odd jobs and manual labor of some sort, because he was pretty young. And then the Lodz ghetto was one of the last, if not the last ghetto in Poland to be liquidated and sent, have all of its, we'll call them inhabitants, sent to Birkenau, a huge camp, part of the Auschwitz complex, where people were sorted out into those who could work and those that couldn't. And those that couldn't were rapidly dispatched. He wound up going with his dad to a work camp named Ullum, just outside of Hanover. And it's funny, he said that he remembers trying to never talk about this as we were growing up. So as far as he was concerned, he never mentioned it. As far as us kids were concerned, they talked about it all the damn time. Because and there's nothing inconsistent about that. Because there's not a lot of story of that level that a kid can tolerate. And compared to what was, bubbling in his mind, I'm sure he said nothing. Very emotional, really hard to get through. But at the end of the war, he was deathly ill, too weak to move. So as the Americans were advancing into Germany, the Germans said, okay, they're coming in, they're going to kill everyone. So if you want to live, come with us. And everyone that could move got up and left, went with the Germans, and when they were out of town, they were all shot. So Dad told this story that he remembers, and it's almost certainly not true, but he remembers this black American soldier, who he thought was about 7.5 feet tall, came in and busted down the door, looked around to see what was going on, and quickly got everything going. People in that squadron said there were no blacks. Memory is a funny thing. And very quickly, medical attention was given. The people were taken care of. They wound up. There were a large number of were called DP or displaced persons camps, where people were rejuvenated and allowed to heal and come back to some semblance of their humanity. And my father decided. My parents were married by this point. Decided he wanted to come to the U.S. So the guy asked him, "How old are you?" To which my father responded, "How old do I need to be?" And he said 18. He said, "Good, I'm 18." He was 17. So you may find an interesting one-year discrepancy in the year of my father's birth, whether it's 1927 or 1928. On all those papers, his birthday was 1927, because that made him 18 at the time. In fact, he was born in 1928. So he arranged to come to the U.S., join the U.S. Army. My mother came to the U.S., worked in the Army mostly because he wanted to learn about the country, learn about the people, and wanted to learn English. You mentioned Alam, a soldier from Sioux Falls, Iowa, if I remember correctly, by the name of Vernon Tott, took pictures of the camp that day. A survivor who lived across the bay in Oakland, when he retired, said, I'm going to find these guys. And from memory, drew the patch that he remembered on their shoulder and sent it off to the Pentagon and said, "What group is this?" He found out, sent a letter to that squadron and said, "Does anyone have any memories, any recollection about this?" And Vernon read the newsletter from his squadron and said, I think I still have those pictures. So there's a documentary called The Angel of Alam about that, which is pretty amazing. Yeah, we met Vernon in Germany. I did. My parents had met him, of course, before. But there was a ceremony for, I think it was it would have been the 60th anniversary of the clearing of the Lodz Ghetto. Vernon was in the process of dying of cancer. But he came to Germany and participated with us in this. Really quite moving.
Focus on business is war.
Right. Don't you want to speak about sex?
Maybe later.
Okay.
My father, for him, business was his life. On the other hand, it was very important for him that family be supported and be involved, and he was quite keen on the idea of his sons working for him.
And I went to see him, and I walked into his office, and Jack was this short, rotund, bald, swarthy, sort of had large, protruding eyes, and a deep, booming voice that actually made the walls vibrate. It was so baritone. And he was very intimidating.
I don't know of many other people that could run things quite the way he did. The most surprising thing when you look at the way companies are structured between the lowest level person and the top, there's 2 or 3 levels. That's it. And no one's that far away. And this wound up with an enormous number of people that reported directly to my father.
He hired me, and he said, but your job will not be to assist me. Your job will be to follow me around and learn the religion. Jack's philosophy of business, he called it the religion.
There are lots of ways to run a business. And if you're going to run a business where the CEO is this warm, gentle, encouraging, mentoring person who leads people through a path of internal and emotional development while they generate a wonderful, life-changing product, great. And I'm sure there are companies that do very well under that model. That wouldn't work with my dad as CEO.
In my personal job was not to tell them how good they are, but to tell them what they're doing wrong so they can improve. We live today in a different world. Oh, you did such a good job, my God.
I went to the CES show. Jack Tramiel was on the stand. He was barking orders to everybody. He was quite aggressive. I had about 30 seconds with him, and I just said, hello, I'm David from the UK. He shook my hand and then dismissed me with his eyes.
My father was put in touch with a financier in Toronto by the name of Irving Gould, who I think that time got 20% of the company.
Very bluntly asked him one day, I said, Irving, I know you're a wealthy man. Obviously you invested heavily into Commodore and other companies. Would you mind telling me how you made your money? And I thought he was just going to throw me out, but he didn't. He said, yeah, I'll tell you. And I'll tell you exactly the words he used. He said, David, I took the best piss of my life. And I just stood at the urinal, and a young man came in, and the young man's going, said, well, these guys have invented a system of 20-foot and 40-foot containers that can get picked up and carried on lorries, and they can get put onto special container ships, cargo ships. And he said, and I just brought to my company, to the table, the opportunity to have the rights for North America for the containerized, and they've just turned it down. And Irving just said, you've just found your man.
Commodore programmers put together a game called Jack Attack, and they named it after Jack.
At Commodore, we have something that's sort of urban legend and yet has its basis in truth, and it's called a Jack Attack. And Jack Attacks can actually occur one-on-one, right? Where you might say, I just can't work this way. You'd be the president of Commodore and say, I can't work this way, and Jack would say, well, then don't. That meant you're fired. You're just out. We lost an entire office one time because they wanted royalties.
I went to lunch, I came back, I looked at the 12 offices, and they were all empty. I went up to the receptionist and I said, "Where's the marketing department?" And she's looking down. She's looking down and writing on a yellow notepad. And she said, "Oh, they're gone. Jack came and fired them just before lunch."
The Jack attack. I have no idea where the term came from. The first time I heard it was long after Commodore ceased to be. But as I said, when my father was displeased, he made no secret of it. I remember as early as the times I was working in the warehouse, that I would be, in the warehouse, moving pallets around, and I could hear Dad yelling in his office, and I knew someone had not done exactly what he wanted.
Jack was thought of as being ruthless sometimes because he held you to your word. A young engineering manager once promised to deliver something to him, and he wanted 6 months to do it. So he built up a staff of 30 people and he started working on it. 6 months later to the day, Jack showed up and said, "Is it done?" The engineer said, "No, we had some complications. We won't have it done for another 6 months." Jack fired everybody and closed down the operation immediately. Later that afternoon, I was in Jack's office when one of the engineers came in, storming in. He was in his 20s. And he said, "I've been here for 5 years. I'm not leaving. I helped build this company. I'm going to sit in the hallway if I have to. I'm not being fired." And Jack said, "Fine, go find yourself another job." And you know what? If the 29 other people in that group were smart enough to come and do that, they would still have their jobs.
If he thought you were giving him nonsense, he would let you know at usually fairly high volume levels. Along with percussion on the nearest horizontal surface. So, and when he was displeased, it was obvious. If you were emotionally resilient enough to handle that, and to realize that the criticism was not criticism of you as a person, but criticism of the job you had done, and could grow and learn from it, then you wind up with a group of people that will work very well under those circumstances.
My best Jack story happened in Germany. I had one of the Mercedes for the show, and my job was to chauffeur Jack and Sig around. They'd spend a lot of time talking, spend a lot of time touring the show, spend a lot of time in bars. So one time they'd both gotten really drunk. So we were both singing in the backseat, singing German songs. They were having a great time. And Jack told the story of how he built this road that we were on because he was a prisoner of war in Germany.
Everyone talks about him designing all these machines, which he neither designed nor actually knew how to use. The first computer that he was actually comfortable using was an iPad. And when he got comfortable using it, he just took to it immediately. But he never learned to program, never was interested in doing any of that stuff. He knew it wasn't magic, but assumed that if he needed any expertise, he would just hire it, or he had a son that could do it for him, so he's fine.
My dad brought home in 1977 a Commodore PET 2001. Much like the gamers today that spend all their time in their bedrooms, that's what I did with a PET.
My first computer was a Commodore PET 4032.
My first experience of computers was the Commodore PET. The Commodore PET has certain characteristic sounds when you get to know it. First of all, there's the sound and the feel of your fingers on the keyboard, the sort of crunching sound. A comforting sound, really, once you're used to it. Not like keyboards today, or even, God forbid, flat glass screens that make no sounds, where you have to put a synthesized sound in place. The actual touch from the touch typing was an important feedback mechanism for the machine. It was, as I think about it quite nostalgically, it was a very comfortable way.
Chuck moved out to California, assembled a small team of people to work on the PET. He did an awful lot of the work himself, but there were a few incredibly talented engineers involved, Chuck and me. Chuck knew that it needed to come with a programming language so that you could use it fresh out of the box. And the best one available at the time, and to some extent the only one, was Microsoft Basic. You know, Gates comes in and says he wants $1 a machine. And my father's response was, I'm already married. So he offered Bill what at the time must have seemed like an enormous amount of money, $50,000, which he took. Couple of years later, Bill is walking around with this entourage of Japanese businessmen, and he comes up to the Commodore booth. If you typed Wait 6502, the next number would be the number of times the word Microsoft was printed on the screen. And that's what he expected to happen. Instead, the machine just hung. And I leaned over to Bill and said, you know, there's nothing at that address. It's just going to hang there. And he gave me the if looks could kill look. And I realized what he was doing. He said, your BASIC has been incredibly important to the success of this machine. It's a great product, and I'm really glad we have it in our computers. And as a result, he let me live. You may remember, first thing one of these machines did would say Commodore BASIC with so many bytes free. So we loaded a program that would read the number of bytes free off of the screen, decode that. If it wasn't the right number, it meant that the memory had failed its online power test. So the very first PETs actually self-diagnosed, which was pretty remarkable. The first model PET had this little, as they call it, chiclet keyboard with the little plastic things that came off on your fingers, and a cassette tape. The next model had a larger full typewriter space and keyboard, and then you would use an external cassette drive. My main sort of single contribution to the system was the graphics character set. And the only instruction I got from Chuck was 4 of those images have to be hearts, diamonds, spades, and clubs, because I want to play blackjack. I think the goal was to have the machine running for the winter CES, Consumer Electronics Show, which didn't work. We eventually figured out what was wrong. There was a resistor missing on the main circuit board. Otherwise, everything worked perfectly, but we didn't know that until a couple of weeks later. So enormous amounts of work went into meeting the deadline of these shows. Yeah, so there was a lot of pressure at that first Hanover Fair, so I guess that would have been spring of 1977. It was my job to take the PET. It got its own seat on the airplane next to me, which was lots of fun. Then we had to go through German customs. What do you mean this is a computer? Computers are tens of millions of dollars, and they're the size of a room. No, it can't be a computer. What are you talking about? We went back and forth a couple of times. In the meantime, we had missed the connecting flight from Frankfurt to Hanover. So we rented a VW microbus and drove from Frankfurt to Hanover. Took the PET, plopped it down on the table, plugged it in, and it didn't work. So on the phone, we had to diagnose what was going on and repair the machine. Got it working, and that was a lot of fun.
VIC-20 with 8K expansion probably could have got away with it at the time, so that was all good.
Just fat graphics.
Yes.
We like the fat graphics.
Was it 22?
22, yeah. Yeah, it was, I mean, the difference between the VIC and the Commodore's graphics, yes, the Commodore was better, but sometimes the VIC version is better.
Oh, look at that.
Commodore was a very international company. We were the third largest personal computer company in the world, but we were number 3 in the U.S., but we were number 1 in Europe. So as a result of having sold the Commodore PET computer, which was very popular, especially in schools. So here we were at this meeting, and it was a large room with about 25 people seated around a square table that was open in the center. So Jack came in, and the engineers, they wanted to do a color computer like an Apple. And Jack said, I want a small introductory computer. I want a small computer that plays games and for the masses, not the classes. And as soon as he said that, the whole room erupted. And everybody said, no, we have to do a business computer. We have to compete with Apple. We have to do a personal computer. We have to do larger computers, not smaller. And Jack said, I want the small computer, but you talk about it and I'll come back tomorrow. I'll have some business. So he left.
Dad calls, and he says, the engineers have come up with a new machine. I'd like you to come and take a look and see what you think of it. Go to Chicago, go to the Commodore booth. So there's this little machine in a rectangular box hooked up to a TV showing all sorts of PET graphics, character set stuff, but in color. And that was the birth of the VIC-20.
And that became the first generation of home computers, the first million-seller home computers that seeded the market.
I came on as part of the VIC Commando team, which was the VIC-20 product launch team.
So we launched the VIC-20 at the Consumer Electronics Show in 1981. It was a hit. It actually went on to become the first million-seller home computer. It's the first microcomputer of any kind to sell 1 million units.
When we first got the VIC-20, I had to share it with my brother. It was actually my parents bought it for me and my brother. He's 3 years older than me, and we didn't have anything else. We just had the computer and a TV. So we didn't have any games for it. We didn't have any software for it. All we had was the computer and the manual. And so we started playing around, trying to figure out how to program in BASIC using the, they had some example programs in the manual, and it would teach you how to do things. And then, once I learned that, I started making my own programs.
The VIC could be programmed, but it only had 5K of RAM memory. When you turned it on, the 5K shrunk down to 3.5K. 3.5K is basically one sheet of typing paper's worth of memory. Today we have gigabytes.
The fat graphics really added to some of the shooters.
They were just chunky but fun.
Yes. And sort of the sound effects were just sort of raucous and just, well, you're firing everything out the sound chip. Why isn't it blowing up? But it was that good.
The sound was massively loud through the speakers, thinking, is this real? Is this going to really happen? But that was as it was. It got your attention. Some massive, overly loud zapping sound that draw you straight in. Like, oh, playing this then. You'd always have to be wary of the fact of, oh, can this game run on an unexpanded VIC, or do I need 8K or 16K expansion? And thankfully, a lot of games companies realised that you didn't want to take a chance with the game and realise it didn't work, so they'd always put unexpanded VIC-20 in nice big bold letters on the cover.
We wired up the memory externally to the VIC-20, and that gave us a full 8K of RAM to develop cartridges in. Once we got that, we could actually start developing more significant cartridges, more complicated games like Omega Race, Gorf, Sargon 2 Chess, the adventure games, and things like that. Couldn't do those in 3.5K, but 8K was barely enough.
Some of our family members gave us some Christmas presents that were VIC-20 cartridge games, we got Omega Race and some kind of like Sea Battle or something like that. And Omega Race was definitely the best one, though. I still have that cartridge.
The real winner, of course, was the Commodore 64. Yeah, so the Commodore 64, which was the natural outgrowth of the VIC, the same people that designed that VIC chip designed the VIC-2, which is what powered the Commodore 64. And then it had an absolutely brilliant sound chip.
That was a long drive, about 10 hours, right?
And the Commodore, with its sound interface device, or the SID chip as it's affectionately known, really bundled up a hardware synthesizer inside a home computer. And I knew then that that was a computer that I just had to get my hands on.
A lot of the music on the games at that time, in the very early 80s, was just really awful.
And we did a couple of VIC-20 things, and then we kind of went on to the 64, really, which was indeed, obviously, the SID chip.
The Commodore 64 sound chip, it was a decade ahead of everything else. So even to the stage of where the Amiga came out, the Amiga couldn't do the sounds that the Commodore 64 was doing. It was that good.
I just had to choose the C64 because of the 64K memory and the fact that it had a sound chip where none of the others did.
Hearing a piece of Rob's. I think it was his arrangement of English Country Gardens was it for Hover Bother or something like that? But it was a lovely arrangement and had some lovely little sounds and little twiddles in it.
Commodore 64 was a huge eye-opener, and it was also a bit of an equalizer at home in terms of the different age groups getting people together and play a game, where the youngest in the family could beat the oldest or something,
There was no internet at the time, or there was no easy way. Even getting to the library was difficult. It was very hard for your parents to haul 5 kids to the library. But, there was these gems of resources that we would find just on trips to the grocery store. I knew there was a bookstore that was nearby. Bring a pad and paper and actually write the machine code myself, copy it, because I couldn't buy the book. And so I would sit there while my mom was shopping or while she was doing her thing. I would come home and have a piece of it, bring it to my Commodore 64 and have that stored, and I would have to wait another week to go by to get that next little piece.
First Commodore 64 for, I think, 3 to 4 years, and bearing in mind it was second-hand anyway, but it got to the point where it would only load games if the cassette deck was upside down, and sometimes I had to bang the computer on the desk to get it to work. I guess I was seating the chips back in their sockets, but as a 12, 13-year-old, I had no idea about that sort of thing.
I've been a Commodore 64 fan since 1985, and in that time I've been involved in programming, composing music, running a disc magazine, and have also written a book about Commodore 64 games.
Commodore 64 was an amazing machine. My best friend Sean at school, he had a Commodore 64, and I was a little bit envious. It's actually one of the newer ones that came out, the little, sleek-looking white ones. Joe Blade was a brilliant game on the Commodore 64. It was actually set in, the far distant future in the year 1997, when London had been taken over by thugs. And we got really far in that game, and I remember we actually left this Commodore 64 on for about a week because, we didn't want to lose our high score.
And when I got the Commodore, the technology of the sound chip meant that I could explore musical ideas that perhaps lay just beyond my technical playing ability. I was really into ragtime, for example, and I'd heard a couple of ragtimey kind of tracks in Rob Hubbard's soundtrack to Action Biker and then Martin Galway's soundtrack to Kong Strikes Back. And that was the point really when I realised that the Commodore 64 could be a vehicle for exploring composition and performance in a way that didn't necessarily rely on instrumental technique.
I love music, and you know, we wanted to do something different with music. And I remember seeing this advertisement in one of the computer magazines from this guy, Rob Hubbard, who basically was, you know, I'll write music for your games, and I think he even posted us a cassette to say, you know, here's some of the stuff I've done.
Eventually it clicked as to, you know, as to how it works and what it was actually doing. And then once you get that stuff working without the computer crashing, then basically it was like Pandora's box opening up. I was thinking much more about the SID chip.
It kind of became like a popularity contest, really. The more games you had, the cooler you were at school. And if you were that kid that would come in with that, you know, new game that had just come out in the shop on Monday morning that every kid in school was asking for, you'd be the most popular kid in school that week.
Commodore gaming was promoted through the use of clubs. Whoever had the faster ability of doing or this would obviously be the winner. And whoever got the most points, we used to buy prizes as opposed to sweets. Obviously the Greek element would be buying a pile of souvlaki.
At school there are lots of people with different machines. I had a friend who had a Spectrum, and I had friends who had the Commodore 64 as well, and we would occasionally swap games to try something out. I remember one lunchtime running home from school with Ghostbusters, the tie-in to the film, and playing that for about half an hour instead of having lunch.
There was a real awful sample that was used on Ghostbusters, so it became apparent that you could do samples. Ghostbusters! What I wanted to do was try to find a way to get be able to play a sample, not just a little speech sample with nothing else going on, but to get get something integrated in the music. So distorted rock guitar was an obvious choice.
What could I do sound, you know, with the technology to get more out of the sound chip? And one of the things that I developed was sampling. I realized you can play the SID voices, the 3 voices, while the sampling plays over it. And that was a revelation. And they did it with the volume register.
The Commodore 64 now was the one that myself and my brother, we sort of saved up our money. We worked overtime. We heard this machine was coming out and it was going to be the greatest, most wonderful new thing. And we saved up our money and we as teenagers and bought a Commodore 64. And my goodness, we were very happy with it. An absolutely amazing machine.
What was the culture like at Commodore UK? Was it hard work? Was it a lot of partying? What went on?
There was always partying. We really, I guess, supported the idea that you work hard and you play hard.
As soon as David joined, I met David Pleasance when he first joined the company in sales. I was already there. And David was a master of creating interesting bundles for retail. Great program that was developed while I was there was international soccer.
I walked past a computer store and I saw a game playing in the window, and it was international soccer on a Commodore 64. And there was color, there was sound, there was animation, there was graphics. I just had to have that machine.
This game was unbelievable, and it was only possible because the 64 had sprites. No other computer had these programmable, movable objects.
So the SID station was a project at Chalmers University of Technology where a couple of guys had this course to make something that involved programmable logic. And they had two ideas. One was like a MIDI CV converter and the other was something called SID-O-Mania. And SID-O-Mania was a synthesizer based on the SID chip. The SID station is a tabletop synthesizer module, so it's got a few direct controls that control just sound parameters. It's got a few things for entering tables and stuff that you would do on a regular Commodore 64 in a tracker, but in a hardware box.
Hey, there's this company called Commodore hiring. I need to get out of here. And so without really knowing who, I was saving my money for an Atari 400. I couldn't even afford an 800 back then. So I didn't know much about Commodore, and I was about to become an Atari fan, but that stopped the day I got to Commodore.
We brought this Commodore 64, and it was totally amazing because, you know, we had a PDP-23, I think it was, and the boss was very, you have to be very careful around the PDP-23, and here's Bill with this Commodore 64, and you can type in load, $8, $8 or whatever, but, you know, it would give you a disk drive and a directory and all these things. And I was like, you know, working on computers seems a little bit more interesting than building scales.
So I go to interview with Bob Russell, who had, worked on parts of the VIC-20 and C64. And, you know, it's going okay and stuff, but then at one point he said, why am I load X immediate 02? And I go A502. And he looks at me and he goes, then I'd store immediate, I'm like AD0109. I'm muttering the opcodes that I know from having worked on the 6502 so closely. And I saw his body language change, you know, he's like, okay, we'll have you down to the plant type thing. Well, he phrased it so nonchalantly, just swing by the plant. I thought I was going for burgers or something, right? So I don't even bring my resume. And I'm in like corduroys or something when I swing by. And first thing I do when I go to interview with Shiraz Shivji, who was the guy who's either going to hire me or not, he had his desk turned around the wrong way and I didn't notice it. So I walk in and plop myself in his chair. And he walks in and has to, like, excuse me, you are in my chair. Oh, all right. And then he goes, where's your resume? I'm going, I didn't bring one. And it's over. The interview's over at that point. But now Frank Hughes stops by, the guy I did work. He goes, oh, Shiraz, I got it. So he brings it in, and I'm starting to, you know, kind of hit my stride talking and stuff. And I just happened to mention the vibrating wire technology. In other words, one of our competitors. But I went into the detail, you know, if you say you're a satellite, you better be able to talk satellite. Well, I'm weighing instrumentation, so I better talk it. And what I did there was I said it uses a reference weight versus a regular weight, and it can even work on the moon. And Shiraz looked at me and said, you meant mass. And I was hired because he got to correct me. I was early enough when I joined Commodore where we were still up in the MOS building. And so it's these tiny rooms painted psychotic blue, and there was 3 engineers in there, and if you didn't need the door, you could have put a 4th engineer in there. And none of us cared, because like there's a chip fab right below our feet and stuff. So that's where I did what became known as the TED series of computers. I did that while working at the MOS building. And then after we moved down to Westchester into that huge facility there, we got Headley and a guy named Terry Fisher, Fish, who joined us, and he did all the PC boards. So we had like the cream of the crop of the scale company was now down here.
One of the very first tasks I was given came from a guy named Andy Finkel, and he told me to rewrite the cassette loader code for the C128 to make it run faster and run better than the code that was used on the C64, but he put this one perverse constraint. You cannot move any labels. So every label in the assembly code had to stay in exactly the same place because Andy was of the opinion that programmers would randomly jump to any label that had gotten out there and they were all public. So it was a very odd thing to have to do, but that's what I ended up doing.
The John Lennon-looking guy from the outside was there, and that was Bill Hurd. And he proceeded to ask me some technical questions about saturation limiting diodes on the input of op amps, and also about Laplace transforms, which he didn't know how to do. And I was like, yeah, so I think we had a really good interview. And sure enough, a day or so later, they called me in to visit Commodore on Monday and offered me a job on the spot.
I had the long hair going, so I looked like Floyd the drummer off the Muppet Show, the way he walked. And so, so I was unlike most people, because in California I might have been more normal, but here out on the East Coast, our engineers had actually turned into a pretty stodgy bunch, and I was able to help turn it back into Animal House, and then we had fun.
A guy I used to work with was a guy named George Robbins. He was a character. I say we lived at Commodore. We worked at Commodore. We would go home at night and at least sleep in our bed, occasionally take a shower and show up the next day. George lived at work. George had 2 cubicles where the rest of us had 1. George had a nest.
George had managed to get caught once driving a car with no driver's license, an expired registration, and no insurance.
I parked the truck against a telephone pole. After the cops were done with me, and I'd taken care of a little detail, like call Headley. So he gave me a ride in Commodore. Not long after, I became known as the resident Commodore person.
So George just decided he was going to live at Commodore. Greg Berlin and I had discovered that down in the factory area, up like in this weird sort of mid-floor area in the factory, there was a place where they would stash all the Herman Miller furniture to improve our offices by putting up doorways and things that weren't ever supposed to be there. And George had done the same thing, only even more so, that he had kind of made himself a little room that he could close off, which we called his nest.
Yeah, well, I was the one that coined the phrase nesting. Whereas I had the air mattress and stuff, George would sleep in bubble wrap. And then he'd get up and he'd be walking around and he'd have these red rings, blinking his eyes and stuff, but he'd have these little impressions all over his face from the bubble wrap. And when you went to look for George, because he didn't always sleep in the same place, you'd look under something and see like a foot sticking out of bubble wrap. It's found him, and it's literally like a mouse nest at that part. So we called it nesting.
I kept a sleeping bag. I could sleep under my desk when I needed to, but I wasn't planning to live there full time. But George kind of was, and he'd also take sort of sponge baths in the bathroom. We didn't have a shower, so yeah, he was kind of a character. I mean, that's just part of it. George got paid in cash. He didn't have a direct deposit, and at some point they found out that he had like 6 months of uncashed paychecks in his drawer in his office because he was never leaving, or maybe to eat he'd drive. All of us had cars and we'd go out.
And we're all in our 20s and 30s, and we're getting paid good money, we think, and we're doing okay. And George has decided he needs money, and he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out 6 months worth of paychecks. What the hell is that, George? He's like, oh, I need to cash all stuff. Because he needed to deposit, because he didn't spend any money, because he didn't have any expenses. He lived in the building, right? So he had this huge pile. He filled out 6 months of paychecks, and of course I'm sitting there going, oh man, what I could, we're all like, wow, that's a chunk of change,
So he was forced by personnel to open an account with direct deposit because I guess they didn't like the idea of checks not being cashed. Yeah, it was funny. You could come up with a lot of different George stories if you thought about it.
Yeah, George was a character.
We were to go to CES, and George was an engineer, a key engineer on the product. Actually, it might have been when the A500 came out. And the mandate came down that everybody going to CES had to wear a suit. So you had to have a tie and a suit, and you had to look good. And all of George's attire were blue jeans with battery acid holes in them and ripped T-shirts, just because he didn't feel that dressing up was sort of his thing. But he wanted to go to CES, and so he needed to get a suit. So he goes out and he buys this synthetic material polyester suit, sort of tan colored, right? And he's got the suit. And so now we're in the labs and we have to figure out how to get to CES. So the rest of us have this thing called luggage that we put our clothes in. But George doesn't possess any of this, so he's not sure exactly what he's going to do. So literally he takes a grocery bag and he jams his suit in the grocery bag. He rolls the grocery bag over, and then he puts duct tape on the outside of the bag, and this is his luggage. So he takes this thing, and I'll never forget, sitting there in Las Vegas waiting for the luggage to come down, and it's coming down, and here comes Roland George's bag. So then, what happened? Well, it's a polyester suit, and it's been all scrunched up and compressed. So he puts the suit on, and now the sleeves are like up to here, and he's got this wrinkly suit on, and he shows up. And so management finally said, George, you don't have to work the booth, you know, you don't have to wear the suit, you know, go see CES, and they never really fought him on that again. One of the best engineers I ever worked with.
It took a few years to get around this, and now I have my own car and my own house. And I don't live in Commodore anymore, but I love it anyway.
Commodore stock went through the ceiling. The Commodore stock went up and split a couple of times. In fact, Jack and his 3 sons had a tradition that whenever the stock went up 10 points, they would all stop and share a bottle of Dom Perignon champagne. And I'm privileged to say I was with them several times when they did that. That was pretty cool, and it's a kind of an interesting symbol of the growth that we were achieving. We were not just growing the market. We weren't just giving millions of people a computer that they couldn't afford before. We were also making a lot of money for investors and showing that this was a profitable enterprise.
Jack Tramiel had done his Apple killer. It was the Commodore 64. He's done with Apple. We used to say, Apple who? I mean, that was it. They were cooked in our book. And it's true, and we did 27 million C64s, whereas Apple II might have sold 5.5 million or something. So we didn't need another game machine. What Jack wanted was Sir Clive Sinclair's spot now, you know, and he had the little Spectrum and things, and he's like, I want him next, right? I want that. And so the C116, if you saw it when Schroz pulled it out and showed it to me, it was this big. It was the Raspberry Pi of the day. It was supposed to cost $49. It had chiclet keys, but it had 121 colors, had built-in sound all in one chip. It was basically a chip with a computer built around it, which back then it used to be just lots of chips, right?
The company got more and more successful, and more perks came up, like, as my father called it, the pet jet, although it probably should have been called the Commodore 64 jet. But that didn't sound as good. Irving would demand use of the pet jet whenever he could. And Dad didn't like this. It did not fit with his, morals of what the right thing for a company asset to be used for.
Then there was the one with the full-size keyboard, and TED meant text display. It was supposed to be a business machine. You want to play games, get a 64. As a matter of fact, the price is completely different, right? But we're not trying to compete with ourselves. So Jack had that focus that he knew what he wanted to do with the market.
I think both Commodore and Apple had in 1983, so the CS was in January of 1984, had just each cost $1 billion in annual sales. As I like to point out, Commodore doing it with machines that cost a tenth as much as the Apple machine, so a few more machines being sold.
An argument going on between Jack and Irving upstairs in the booth, and I was there and suddenly I was on the demonstrating, and suddenly I got somebody came over and said, "You've got to come up and explain, the +4 to them." So I went up and I didn't really know Irving. I knew Jack a lot better, and so I went through my spiel, explaining what it was, what we wanted it to do, how it was going to prop up the price of the C64, and they both, the people in the room listened, and then I was dismissed.
There was a celebration for Commodore's, I guess it was 25th anniversary at the time, or 30th, if I do the math quickly. And Dad gave Irving an ultimatum and said, you can't use company assets as if they're your own. As long as I'm president, you can't. You have to stop. So either you stop doing it or I quit. To which Irving said goodbye. And Dad quit. Just, left the room and quit. Walked by my wife in the hall, and looking rather stern and upset. She was kind of shocked, and he just quit. There are all sorts of stories. I think the official Commodore story is that there was a board meeting in New York a couple of weeks later where they fired him. I'm pretty sure he wasn't at the meeting.
When Jack leaves, and he leaves literally at a CES, Jack has a disagreement with Irving Gould. They part ways literally at the CES show. And at that point, Ted literally died because now there is nobody to focus all those things.
The new generation Corvettes. So the three of us got together and bought him one of these Corvettes at that same Consumer Electronics Show. And so Sam and Gary drove it down to Las Vegas for that same show. And unbeknownst to us that this whole quitting Commodore thing was going to happen, we were going to give him this fun present. So Gary arranges to have the car parked in the front of the hotel, and then they went outside just on some pretense. And Dad walks out and sees the car and goes, "That's it. That's the car. That's what I want." And he walks up to it and he goes, "It's the right color and it's got all the right, it's got the right wheels and the right interior and the right everything. And this is perfect." And Gary reaches into his pocket, pulls out the keys and says, "It's yours." Yeah. And then a couple of days later, he quits and hops in the car and drives home.
I didn't really know him. I'd seen him a couple times, but Jack was still there. He didn't leave until after Consumer Electronics Show that January. A couple of weeks after that is when he left. So yeah, so I was there basically for the tail end of the Jack Tramiel era. It didn't really have an impact. A lot of the people who had made the Commodore 64 had left a long time ago.
But without Jack around, the sheep started multiplying. Without a wolf, right? And pretty soon we're stepping in sheet shit everywhere, right? So, and meanwhile, we go from a core of about 12 people, 8 to 12 people doing all the work. The department blooms up to 50, and it's still the same core of 8 to 12 of us doing all the work. They didn't know that a new computer, you have to start over again, get developers on board. And this is more than marketing that dropped the ball. Anybody that had only been there a couple years thought that C64s sell themselves. They sure acted like they did. We sold 27 million. But then they upped the price for the TED series, and they called it the Plus 4, and it became $300. Well, it was designed to be $79. So that thing now dies on the vine. But what that shows then is, with Jack, we had a focus. He didn't think a distributor should make any money off hardware, and he didn't think we should make too much money off hardware. He thinks you should have a good price for a good product, but not overcharge. And distributors like, well, we want to make. No, he said, no, you'll make that on the software, but you don't make it on my hardware. So and he would enforce that. So without him doing that, then here's a $300 thing. Why is that? So he gets 100, he gets 100, and he gets 100.
50 top executives, engineers, and marketeers at Commodore all walked out of the company in 1 week. It's as if we set our time clock 6 months. We never talked to each other. The 6-month point came. We weren't happy with what we saw at the company. We weren't being allowed to develop the new computers that we had in mind. We had a lot of new stuff and prototypes in development. So we all walked out. Greg Pratt, the president of Commodore USA, me, all the VIC commandos, many of the engineers, the whole infrastructure just walked out in 1 week.
I jumped ship to what had been called the D-128. And there's a story with the day that happened. But we ended up in engineering deciding to do the C-128 because no one stopped us. This wasn't from on high. This wasn't, there's our project to plan for this year. A couple engineers, I sat down at a table, I threw away the old guy's design because just wasn't going to go anywhere. Used a little grid paper and hand drew a schematic that became the C-128. And as we'd show it to management when we get a certain distance, and they're like, "This is great. I had a great idea." And I'm like, "Yeah, I need another guy on my team." "Well, yes, you got it," you know. And so we marched it downfield by building up resources and things. But it's like we told them it's now called the C-128, you know, because we decided, it was us that decided to make it Commodore compatible. It's Commodore 64. And we hadn't said 100% compatible. That was marketing once again, drifting through the picture like they were in a drunken haze and saying, "Oh, it's 100% compatible." Well, no, never said that, but we'll try.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I think a lot of people just like the idea of, you know, it's bigger, better, faster, more, but it also runs my old programs. So I don't have to keep a Commodore 64 around. You know, which is, you know, that's a significant thing.
The 128 was there to fill a gap, right? We needed something for CS, and we know the Amiga's coming. I'm actually one of the people that they brought, and I looked at the spec and said, "Why are there tanks instead of business icons?" So we saw the 128 as just basically, if the main thrust of the Allied forces was the Amiga, it was me and my crew went up to the mountains and held the mountain pass for the winter. You know, that's kind of how I look at it. And so the 128 was only meant to sell 1 year.
And, you know, I know we sold, I don't know, 6 or 7 million of them at least. And that was, you know, more than most people, you know, most companies were selling as far as a single model of a computer. It didn't match the, you know, the 20-something million of the C64, but nobody else did either.
There was supposed to be a C-128D, and that was my favorite computer. It was supposed to come out at the exact same time, and that's the one with the built-in drive, the keyboard clipped up under it, and it didn't get made. I didn't know it didn't get produced until after I'd quit, because I kind of wandered off after and I was burnt. I was just fried. I had used a lot of me up in a very short period of time. Do you know the hole in the wall story? Have you heard the hole in the wall story?
Oh, tell us it then.
Okay, so the hole in the wall story. We as you know, we were working very hard and didn't need delays that we didn't need to be there in the first place. And Commodore found a new way to throw one in front of us. And I moved into this one room where I had this big emulator, and on the weekends they would turn off the air conditioner, so I would wear a headband and no shirt, and I would have to keep washing it off about every 20 minutes with spray because I would drip sweat on it, right? But nonetheless, it was my room, and that's where I did my work. Then one day I show up and the door's locked on the weekend. Oh, this is inconvenient. So I climb up over the ceiling, I get that white crap all over me, and I open the door, right? And we put up a sign that says, "Don't lock this door, there is no key for it," because, you know, it was a brand new facility for us, and they never ever turned the key over, we figured. Well, the security guards can't resist a door that can be locked, and locked it again. Climb up over it, get the white crap all over me again, put a sign that says, "No, don't lock this door, there's no key for it." I might have said assholes or something. So finally, it's locked again. They said I punched through the wall in one punch. It was actually two. One for the inside layer, one for the outside layer, to where I could reach in and unlock the door. Right? So by the time I've got it open, now I got the white crap all over my arm now instead of me, and there's a bunch of Z8000 programmers, you know, looking like I just shot a sheep or something. And the next day, they locked the door again. So I had to put a sign up said, "Look, assholes, there's a fucking hole in the wall, stop locking the door." That's the hole in the wall story.
You don't get to bark. We're doing something important here where no barking is important. Are we rolling? Welcome to RJ Michael's House of Construction. You know, you probably won't be able to get to show any of the house, will you? It's,
So I can see it right now.
yeah, oh good, okay, well. I'm RJ Michael, and I was one of the original engineers that invented the Amiga computer a long time ago. And since then, I've done a lot with my life, I've done a lot with my career, and managed to go a lot of places. But I gotta tell you, that Amiga thing stands out as one of the most precious and special periods of my life, and I think the thing I've created that I'm most delighted about.
When I first got into Amiga, I was a very young kid, and this was a fantastic escape, and that machine I absolutely loved.
Sound in the Amiga was a bit of a game changer. So for the first time, video game music and computer music began to sound like production music.
And when I saw the specs of the Amiga and some demos and stuff like that, I was like, this is the next level, you know.
My love is the Amiga 500 and the CD32.
I got an Amiga 1000, and I was probably mostly known for doing the Buttbrain Mega Demos 1 and 2.
Yo, check this out.
The first time I played the Amiga was when my cousin had it. My cousin was 4 years older than me, and so he had this Amiga, and I remember going up to his house, and it was just like this magic.
I'm at the University of Illinois, and I'm an English major. I'm studying to get an English degree. Not sure exactly what I'm going to do with it. Literature, maybe, you know, writing for newspapers or magazines or something like that. But I didn't want to do literature. I didn't want to write for magazines. I wanted to write books. I wanted to do my own creation. But I was afraid of being a starving artist, and that I was going to go out into the real world and be unable to be really successful and have a great income, yada, 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 all the things that I had been taught that I really wanted, which turned out to be not true. But I was scared to go out and get out into the real world with an English degree. And I had this amazing, fateful afternoon that I'm sitting in the computer lab and I'm about to graduate, and I'm worried, what am I going to do out there in the real world with an English language degree? And I'm sitting there in the computer lab worrying, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? And then I'd take a break from my worrying to play some of my computer game, the Star Trek game that I'd played. And I'd play the game for a while, then I'd stop and worry, what am I going to do with my life? What am I going to do with my life? And then I'd play the game and I'd worry, what am I going to do with my life? And finally, hey, I know I could do this stuff. And realized all of an instant in one afternoon that really my calling was to go off and to do software engineering.
In roughly December of 1982, Dave Morse convinced me that I should, come work with him at the initial Amiga. Actually, it was still High Toro at that time. It was named Amiga, I think, a few months after I got there. When I got there, I was the first technical employee of any kind there. Dave had 8 other marketing and salespeople working on the game controller and other things to prep the channel. Jay Miner officially couldn't be there because part of the deal was that he would stay at Zymos and finish the pacemaker. So I arrived there by myself, and then later on, Jay and Joe DeCure would stop by, and the team of the 3 of us were given a room with 3 very large wall-sized whiteboards to come up with a product.
Not only was working at Williams Electronics an amazing experience because it gave me this opportunity to really express myself as a computer scientist, but also as an artist. I'm a storyteller. I love creating music. I love creating graphics and special effects. And it was a job that allowed me to tie all of that together and do something. But even better than that, I met a fellow there that got connected shortly after that with this new company out in California called Amiga Computer.
Dave Morse basically told us what the channel was, what he wanted to put in the channel, and we were given pretty much a clean slate to do it. He wanted something that could produce animation more like the cartoons kids saw on TV. And so we started on the whiteboard just drawing boxes, and one of us would throw up an idea, and Jay would shake his head and say no feasible. Of course, the fourth person in the room was Mitzi, Jay's dog, who would actually sit there watching. The stories are that we would look at Mitchie, and Mitchie would either nod or fall asleep, and we would use that as a cue to the design.
And the original Amiga that I saw in the block diagram had game controller ports as part of its design, and all of that, it checked out as a proper game system, but it also had these extra capabilities. And it was that more than anything else that inspired me to join the company. Because the game stuff was interesting to me, and to create a game platform, I probably would have said yes if it was just that.
The Amiga is sort of the child of Commodore and Apple and Atari. Jay and Joe DeCure had worked in Atari, and of course they knew about the sprite engines that were in the Atari VCS. The chips they had worked with were the 6502, which had come from Commodore, of course, Chuck Peddle's chip. And then I had worked at Apple and learned the tricks that Woz and Burl Smith used in the Apple II and the Macintosh. And of course, the work that Lisa had reinvented from the Xerox Alto. So we sort of combined ideas from that whole ecosystem of computers that had come before. And I think that was one of the reasons the Amiga turned out so well, the cross-pollination of ideas from multiple predecessor designs.
What I saw more than anything else was the quality, the strength of the people that were putting together the company. And yes, the engineering staff was superb, and I was easily convinced by people like Dale and Dale Luck and Ron Nicholson, and of course Jay Miner. But the business people really believed and were extremely well experienced and had the right know-how and the right enthusiasm to be able to make the thing happen. And so I said yes to joining Amiga Computer.
I'm the chairman of the Dutch Commodore user group. Our club is more than 35 years old and still alive and kicking.
I like to collect old computers, mainly Commodores.
We have almost 400 members, and our club meetings are visited by, I think so, about 50 till 100 visitors every time. And 6 times a year we are here in Maarsen, in the Trefpunt, and it's a very nice place to be because we have a lot to do with innovation.
Somehow Dave Needle got introduced to us as a consultant who possibly could help with some of the general hardware design, logic design, and chip design. He came to interview, and actually they didn't like him at the first interview and sent him away. He sort of begged his way back in, basically because he had seen the whiteboard and decided that that whiteboard was better than anything else that he'd seen to work on.
When I joined Amiga, I originally joined with the graphics staff. There's a fellow named Dale Luck who was in charge of the graphics development for the Amiga, and I joined to work for him and to work on graphics. And it worked out well. But as time went on and as the company continued to grow and to develop, I ended up taking on more and more responsibilities for running the team with my boss at the time.
The technology these days is to put billions of transistors on a chip. A few decades ago it was millions. Back when we were designing the Amiga, putting several thousand transistors on a chip was a very difficult task. In retrospect, we were trying to do a project that was nearly impossible for the team size that we had had.
All computers at that point were switching to being user interface oriented. It was no longer good enough to have a computer where the user had to type cryptic text into a text window and command the computer to do things by knowing the right instructions to give. The new world was one where it was a graphical user interface and you interacted with it with your hands, and it was a much more rich and enriching sort of environment that needed to be created. And the Amiga had everything except that. The Amiga did not have a graphical user interface capability. And so at that point in my career, I quit being the director of software engineering for the Amiga Computers Company. And instead, I went back to work being an engineer, and I spent about 7 months developing the user interface for the Amiga that I called Intuition.
We'd have these big wall-sized pieces of plastic that were essentially the layout for the chip. And we were trying to put several tens of thousands of transistors down by hand and get it correct. An engineer nowadays would say, without design tools, that is impossible. You will never succeed. It will never work. So if you believe them, the Amiga chipset is an impossibility that we managed to successfully create. Now, we also had to do this in a reasonable amount of time. Several thousand transistors, a startup company has a certain amount of funds.
It all came down to the trade shows, and in particular, the CES, the Consumer Electronics Show, where it was make or break time for Amiga. We had all these other interesting little novelties going, but the truth was that we either delivered or we were going to run out of money. The money that we had going was good seed money that would get us to the point where we had something working, but we had to go further. We had to find additional investors and turn it into a real system. And the way to get additional investors was to show people that what we had thought we could get working was actually working. And the place to do that was at CES, at the trade show. And so it became one of those deadlines for us, as CES was all important, that it became make or break for us, that we knew that the investors, that the companies that would be interested in this and would show enough interest that it would inspire the investors to give us the money that we needed, that we had to have a good showing at CES. And at the same time, the company really was starting to run out of money, seriously starting to run out of money. And I had already started to become part of more of the executive half of the company at that point. And so I was privy to a lot of the conversations they were having about how desperate things really were and how tight money was becoming. But in general, this wasn't being discussed with the employees because we didn't want people to feel panicky and nervous and not work as well as they might, or start looking for other jobs or something like that if they thought the company was going to fail. And so they kept it low key. They didn't talk a lot about how important these trade shows were, but we all sort of knew. And I wasn't all that comfortable with keeping stuff from the employees, and so I kind of told a lot of people, to some extent, what we're up against and why we needed to deliver.
Dave Morse had a trade show he wanted to target, and so we rushed ahead with the design.
And as we were coming up to one of the early trade shows, and we were both realizing how desperate everything was, and that we really needed to get our best foot forward, but also that we were so close, and with just a little extra work, there were so many cool things we could show. Then we ended up just working all night long. We often worked all night long, and Dale and I got into this thing where we would start playing rock music real loud in the middle of the night to help keep ourselves awake. And when you had to do something like queue up a 5-minute compile, instead of sitting there and potentially falling asleep, you would stand up and dance. And the two of us would take turns standing up and dancing 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning in the software lab to keep ourselves awake while we did our work. And the Led Zeppelin was blaring loud, and we're dancing. And finally the day came that we lost track of time, and our coworkers start showing up to the office, and there's this loud music blaring out of the software lab, and they go back there to look to see what's going on, and there's Dale and me dancing and dancing. We got the reputation then for being the Dancing Fools. That's where we got that nickname. Dale and I were known as the Dancing Fools at Amiga because of that. What we did at Amiga was unprecedented. The strange hardware rig that we put together to create the effect of the Amiga computer.
We got lots of little parts that were individual NAND gates and registers, wire wrap them together, and try to get them running in order to find out if the logic circuits that we had drawn in paper actually work.
Something as simple as an electrostatic shock would wipe them out. And so they had them set up on this workbench in the software lab, but they put chairs that forced you, before you could approach the chips, to walk along a certain corridor where you would step on this electrostatic pad that we had on the ground that would take static electricity away from you so that you wouldn't zap the chips. And anyone that got anywhere near the chips had to step over this pad to get to the chips. So we had this little corridor like an aisle down the center of a church going to the chips at the end. And even better than that, these chips, the output of the chips, we needed to make available to everyone that was in the software lab where we worked. And so we had these massive cables that were the graphics and audio output of these chips. And we ran them up into the air, and then they draped across where the electrostatic pad was and went off to the rest of the software lab. But where they draped across the walkway, they draped down because it was loose, and it made you kind of stoop a little bit. And so as you would approach these Amiga stacks that one day would be the Amiga computer, you were obliged to walk down this one corridor, and just as you got up to the stacks, you had to bow. You had to bow your head in order to get under the wires, and it was like this religious experience that you would go through to approach the hardware. And little did we know at the time that it was, in fact, quite a religious experience that we were creating not only for ourselves, but for millions of people out there in the real world.
My part in that was I actually hand-wired the original 2 motherboards for the Amiga. I did get one working, and that was the one they used primarily to test the first set of breadboard emulators for the chipset, and that was the one that we took down to one of the major trade shows, the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas.
Everyone in the company worked their hearts out to get us to these trade shows and to have not just the technology, but the best marketing presentation we could make. And the geniuses with the booth that we put together for CES was just remarkable. It was an amazing thing that had enough goodness on the outside to inspire everyone. But if you were lucky enough to get an invitation into the inner sanctum of where the actual Amiga demo was going on, then you knew we were in for a real treat, because, man, that Amiga demo was so cool.
A lot of people who saw the demo thought that we must have a fairly large mini computer or IBM mainframe in the next room emulating the output they saw, because they said you can't do this in anything that would, fit inside a personal computer.
Our sales and marketing team at Amiga were just overjoyed with the success that we had, and they decided they're going to take us out and give us this amazing dinner to celebrate the fact that we had such an awesome first day at the Consumer Electronics Show. And we did. We ate a lot of spaghetti and drank a lot of Chianti. It was wonderful. But then after that, Dale and I were talking on our way back from the dinner, and we realized there was still so much more we could do, and that if the first day was a success, the second day could be even better if only we worked a little bit harder. And so the two of us, instead of going back to our hotel rooms, we went back to the CES trade show, and we talked the guards into letting us get back into the booth. And the two of us sat down in that booth, and we stayed up all night long, drinking warm beer and working on the demos to make the demos better, so that on day 2, not only were they great, but they were even a little bit greater than great. I mean, it added just a little bit more extra pizzazz and wonderment to it.
Towards the end of the chips being fabricated, I think we actually got the chips back, and they all worked. Money was not available anymore. Stories that later came out that both Dave Morse and Jay Miner took out mortgages on their house. I I'd only heard that later.
I was actually still working on 64 and +4 things, and I was working with various companies like Infocom to help them port their stuff to the C64 and the +4. But they all seem to have a secret project going with some unnamed computer company who, the locked room type stuff. And while I was there hanging out with them, there were things that they would not talk about.
Atari was in the process of losing $2 million a working day. And they, I don't know how, contacted Dad somewhere in his trip. I think he was in Singapore or something like that, and said, please come to New York. We want to talk to you about buying Atari. And Sam said, we just bought Atari. Come home now. That was an interesting transition. Graduate student in physics, honeymooner, vice president of software for a Fortune 500 company.
I hate to say it, but I've never pulled this punch before. The way that Atari did business back then was miserable. I never abided by that way of thinking about business, that way of cutthroat making money and throw people to the side, and nothing matters more than being successful at making money. I hated that. But they originally gave Amiga Computer money as a check. It was not a great deal, but it was an okay deal, and we were facing doom. Everyone was finally resigning themselves to the fate that Atari was going to get our baby from us, and that we would all be out of jobs, and that this thing that we have dreamed of for all of those years was failing. And at the last moment, when it seemed that there was no hope left, suddenly out of the blue came Commodore to the rescue. And Commodore found out what Atari was offering us for the company, and Commodore said, "Oh, we can do much better than that," they said, and they proposed a very nice, rich dollar amount for the company that sounded great to all of us. It was this awesome moment of negotiation where they offered us, I think it was $4 or $4.25, something. I don't remember the exact number now, but Dave Morris, our fearless leader, turned to all of us and said, okay, well, here's the offer. Do you accept? It's better than zero. It's better than Atari. And everyone that reported to him said, yep, sounds good. Accept this deal. And then he turned back to Commodore and said, no, not quite enough. We're going to have to pass on your offer. And I was like, oh my goodness. To have the courage to have a gun pointed to your head like that and still say no to the best offer you'd heard so far. But they offered him, I think it was originally $4, and they offered him $4.25, something like that. And he said, okay, and the rest was history. Commodore bought the company, and Atari's attempt to get their hands on the technology was foiled, and Dave Morse returned the check to Atari, and I've heard recently that Atari still has that check. And I would like the check, but even just a photocopy would be lovely.
Yeah, so I guess we have Amiga Corporation's account number on the back here. So yeah, $500,000, March 7th, 1984, to Amiga from Atari.
I discovered that it was the Amiga and Commodore had just bought them.
The folk at Atari, and this is presumption, they certainly didn't tell me, thought, all right, we'll fund these guys, and they'll make a nice machine, except they're not going to be able to pay us back. So if they don't pay us within 6 months, we own the technology.
And Commodore infused our company with cash. And suddenly overnight, we were productive citizens. We had powerful big computers that we could use, and we had mag tape drives built into the computer so we could back up our work on a nightly basis, and all this like miracle stuff happened that made us more productive.
Right after the purchase happened, within less than a month, my group was actually sent out to California to work with the Amiga guys to get it ready for launch. We were doing things like printer drivers, device drivers, application software, just generally filling in where they were light on people.
They themselves embraced the Amiga as the next generation that Commodore needed to go in. And so it was this match made in heaven where, oh, it was great, the business was great, the hardware was great, our development environments became great.
You had the development team in Los Gatos who had created a product that they thought would be a game machine. They could not produce it for the price that it would take to compete in the games market. And Commodore acquired the company because they needed to move quickly into the next generation of computers. And you had all these sales and marketing people on the East Coast with totally different ideas, and there was quite a bit of friction.
Amiga in California had this amazing technology that just needed to have a little bit of the low-cost computer from Commodore and the high-tech technology from Amiga and put that together to really come up with an amazing combination.
Everybody in Los Gatos got to go to the launch as a reward. We had this last-minute substitution of GraphicCraft. GraphicCraft was a very early edition, had some bugs, and one of the bugs that still wasn't being tracked down was the flood fill. You could start a flood fill and it would flood, fill the screen, and then keep going and fill all of memory, and so crash the computer. And so, during the demo, during the training when Pariseau trained Andy Warhol, don't do the flood fill. And naturally, during the demo, the live demo, he does the flood fill. And the rows of engineers, we were all sitting together, we were, oh no, because we knew this couldn't work, but somehow it did. It did not crash the machine. And that's just one of those miracles that happen.
My first job was to make the PAL version of the Amiga 1000. And so I was the token guy from Commodore in Westchester, Pennsylvania, that had to go talk to all the guys in Los Gatos and say, all right, we got to make a PAL video output from this computer because the first Amiga was only NTSC.
Well, revolutionary at the time was its multitasking. A lot of the internal concepts, libraries, devices, and so on, were just much more advanced than most home computers had at that time.
I'd heard about the Amiga coming out, and I was like, you've got the developer docs and a photocopier? I have to have them.
The 128 was launched that summer, and then Amiga in the fall. But I wanted to find out about it, and there were these green books you could sign out. You had to put your name on them, and they had serial numbers and everything because they didn't want this information getting out. And Bill Hurd got one, and I think the night or maybe the night after Bill Hurd got his, I stayed late and photocopied the whole thing so I could learn it.
Perfect. The Lonely Mountain. I love weed.
Turn right.
Yeah. Here we go. Oh, this is awesome. Right. Oh my God.
Look at that.
Trying just to lighten it up so you can see your face.
The waterfall right there. Here, we have a little house in town.
Oh.
This is not ready to be lived in yet.
I see what he's saying up there.
Whoa. So I did everything you see. Wow. Every single surface. Wow. An elevator, look down all 3 floors if I ever build a thing. Deal with the plans. They said it just, it's too complicated. So I said, okay, I'll build a model and you can go by that. So I did. I built a model of the whole thing. And they took the measurements, direct, 1/4 inch equals a foot. Everything in the model is actually to scale. Oh. And then I had it here in the house, and a bear got in before I had this door and destroyed it.
So this was a
Didn't
bear
like
that
the
did
design.
that.
I don't know. Yeah, that I did Defender of the Crown on is sitting in there.
All right.
These big speaker boxes there on the other side of the screen. And cold, so it heats and air conditions. And then it flows down into the lot with underground 5 feet down where it's always 59 degrees.
Yeah, wow.
So it'll heat and cool just for the price of the electricity. So I flew to Commodore headquarters in Westchester, Pennsylvania, and grabbed one of the executives, and I had a copy of my Saucer Attack game, which looked pretty professional. I had nice packaging and stuff. On the basis of that, they gave me developer status on the Amiga. I still had to buy one. They didn't give me an Amiga, but they gave me all of the tools that RJ and all Dale Luck and everybody had written in order to allow people to program on the Amiga. And went home and immediately started doing graphics that neither I or anybody else had ever seen before.
I saw Defender of the Crown. It was, as I remember it, a full colour spread of the castle scene with the catapult of Defender of the Crown, and it blew my socks off. It was a complete game changer. To see something so beautiful, so artistic, and almost photographic from a computer was something that I had never seen before. And my mind was made up that I obviously needed an Amiga.
Defender of the Crown was the scenario was written by Kellenbach, and he approached Bob Jacob, who was a producer at the time, with the idea of doing one of the first Amiga games as a cinematic game based on the movie Ivanhoe.
That launch of the Amiga 1000 in Europe was pretty amazing. And that really started it all. And because of those relationships that I had both with the factories and the vendors in the Far East, the engineers in Westchester, Pennsylvania, the engineers in Los Gatos, California, and all the customers for the Amiga in Europe, that's what brought me to the alignment of the planets that got the Amiga 500 to say, okay, let me see if I can get this to a point where we can dramatically make a difference in terms of the cost of this product and make it available to a lot more people.
Now, I couldn't afford an Amiga 1000, but fortunately, Commodore did them a wonderful thing. They introduced the Amiga 500, which allowed my mum to buy me one in 1987, I think it was. And what a wonderful machine the Amiga 500 was. It brought the power of the Amiga to the masses. It really did create a software market, a hardware market, and brought wonderful technology to the average person.
Batman, of course, set the whole barometer because it was a movie that was anticipated probably like never before and probably never since, as that one particularly was. And I've got the most amazing respect for Ocean Software for having the guts to go along with that idea. But that's where the whole idea, the concept is create something which is bigger than the sum of the parts. And we specifically had the Amiga as a very small, oh, by the way, there's an Amiga in the box. It wasn't about selling. If you remember, I came up with a concept, from now on we don't sell computers, we sell dreams. And that's what we did. Everything we produced was a dream.
We had Dale Luck come to Westchester. We had Bart Whitebrook come to Westchester. So, you know, we didn't want to lose the software guys, but unfortunately, couldn't help it. Some people moved on.
There's a lot more to do on the Amiga 2000 because nothing had been done really. The 500, I think, at that point was pretty close to finished.
A lightning storm in Texas. The lightning came through the phone line and zapped my 128D. Fortunately, I had insurance. So with the insurance money, I purchased my first Amiga. It was Amiga 2000. So you could say my progression to Amiga was actually an act of God. Or at least that's what it said in the insurance policy.
Now, they did the sidecar for the A1000, but they wanted to make an Amiga that would just take a regular PC card and use slots that were like IBM slots. So they came up with this idea of the Amiga 2000, which at that time was really just the A1000 design with the expansion board from the Zorro added onto it.
At the same time that I was working on the Amiga 500, there was a team in Braunschweig, Germany, building an Amiga 2000, because really the 1000 was trying to service two markets with one computer, and it couldn't really do that too well. You know, it was too expensive for the home and not expandable enough for a serious user. So you ended up with a 500 and a 2000, and that was really a pivotal step in the Amiga to make that successful. So you had people like Newtek that made the video toaster in the United States that could do amazing things with a 2000 because now they could plug a card in. And you had, you know, high school and college kids that could afford to buy an Amiga and get into programming or graphic design where they couldn't do that before.
I ended up getting a job at Commodore, working for Andy Finkel initially. I had thought about cutting my hair before that because I had long hair at the time. It's like, you know, I think I'm just going to go down and see if they accept me as I am, and they did. So I and Bryce Nesbitt both started around the same time.
When the 600 was introduced, by the way, it was supposed to be called the A300 because it was supposed to cost less. And it turns out the team of engineers that they put on designing this, cost-reducing the 600, couldn't out-cost-reduce Jeff. It's 500. So they ended up having to call that a 600 because it actually cost more. So, and they still went into production with it. But, so now you've got two computers that are pretty similar, right? And how do you market that? And so the Germans saw this and they said, well, why do we need a 600 when the 500 is cheaper and does at least as good a job?
When Mehdi made the decision that probably put the final nail in the coffin of Commodore, which was to launch the 1200 with AA, but not commit to enough chips to make the entire production for Christmas be the 1200. Instead, he built like 300,000 old chipset 500s, and most of which stayed in the warehouse because who wants to buy the old machine when you can get the brand new machine with more colors and faster processor and everything else?
The 1200 wasn't actually available in volume until like December, and so you pretty much missed the Christmas season. So if you introduced the 1200 in November and you only had a limited supply, you're only going to frustrate people at Christmas time that they can't buy the computer that they really want to buy.
A lot of things that were going wrong all at the same time in those days, and it was pretty obvious to us all. It's just, you know, you're technology people, and you've sort of gotten along thinking that every problem is solved by technology, and it's certainly not.
The idea was that when we launched the CD32, which was planned for the late spring, early summer of the following year, they would have had games that were written specifically for the CD32. And then he comes and he says, I want to launch the CD32 for Christmas. And I fought and fought and fought against it. I said, are you mad? He said, what's wrong with you? I said, first of all, you're going to kill the 1200. No, don't be silly, this is a completely different product. you're going to kill it. I said, but not only that, you're asking us to launch something when there is no software written for it. And that is not good for us. That's crazy. Let's just keep it as we plan. We need the money. We're in big financial trouble. We need the extra sales. And I kept saying to him, they're not going to be extra sales. They may replace 1,200 sales, but they're not going to be extra sales. He wouldn't listen.
So Commodore had this nasty habit of announcing bad news after the close of business on Friday. And so they announced their bankruptcy after the close of business on Friday. Well, a good portion of us were at Mike Sinn's wedding and did not know that. You got to Randall's house and they had a news article taped on the door, so everyone who went in would notice that, note that Commodore had gone out of business the night before.
We got a copy of the announcement that was made to the worldwide press. That's how significant we weren't. We just got a copy, the same as everybody else did. Commodore announces liquidation and la-di-la-di-la. And they hadn't even got the guts to pick up the phone and say, thanks for all your help, but, it didn't work. We're declaring bankruptcy. But there again, I'm not surprised about that. I didn't have any regard for the management. I said, apart from I had a fair fondness for Irving Gould, but I had no regard for the management side of Commodore International, and so I'm not surprised at how they handle things.
I left before the end. I was lucky. I got out while there was still severance money. My stock options still had some value. And not only that, but I left and went without paying admission to the Software Publicists Association meeting. And I went into a multimedia conference, and I was sitting in the audience, having been Multimedia Personality of the Year in the UK a few years before. And there's this panel discussion, and the moderator at the end of the panel says, Gail, we have the mother of multimedia applications sitting in the audience. Gail, is there anything you would like to say? And I thought, So I took a deep breath, did one of the hardest things I've ever done in my life. I stood up and said, yes, I'd like to say I'm looking for a job. And I got one.
We were able to create a machine that was low cost, so very powerful, took the industry by storm. For the longest time was the video editing platform of the world. And that's what we wanted. We wanted to create a machine that anyone could use and that anyone could afford, that anyone could understand, but I didn't know that we would be as successful as we were, and how many millions of lives we ended up touching with the thing that we had created. And I often get emails from people who say something like, hi, I just wanted to drop in and thank you for that Amiga computer thing that you did. It inspired me to get a job in computer graphics, or it inspired me to get a job in commercial development or game development. I get these wonderful letters from people that each and every one of them is like gold to me. It validates what we believed from the beginning, that we could create a machine that would open up people to new capabilities that they had, and to reveal to themselves the sorts of things they might be able to do with their lives. And we were so successful at that. I'm delighted to say, I'm proud to say that part of our mission we were able to accomplish.
I'm at Amiga 32 Germany, and just bloody look at it. How many people are here? It's just absolutely crazy.
They are still showing brand new software. They are writing for a computer that I developed 34 years ago that I thought would merely be a museum piece. And the gaming industry and the Amiga fans have kept it alive in a way that I could have never imagined.
I think that 8-bit sound is the musical equivalent of candy. It speaks of childhood, but it speaks of something more. It speaks of a kind of uplifting, joyous celebration of everything that childhood represents. It's safety, it's warmth, and above all, it's fun.
Yeah, there has been quite a nice retro revival over the last few years. There's constantly games being released on, like Steam and other platforms that recreate the vibe of the old days.
And I sometimes look back and think, if I'd have known this stuff was going to last this long, I'd have probably taken it a bit more seriously.
This crazy room with 500 plus people here in Germany, 30 years later, celebrating that amazing computer and the technology that went into it.
You'll have this purple throbbing Amiga monster in all your houses controlling everything. Let's get rid of these Macintoshes and these PCs and iPads and all that. Let's go back to the roots of Amiga.
We started a YouTube channel called The Guru Meditation, named after the famous Guru Meditation error you get when your Amiga crashes, and we have a sense of humor.
My name's Mark Kale, I'm from System 3. What does Commodore mean to me? Well, it means passion, and it was a life changer for us. All our best games came from the Commodore 64 and the Amiga.
And they can look back and say, oh, I had one of those, or I wanted something like that, or so it's really fun for me to be able to share what I have with everybody here.
Well, my name's Andy Spencer.
And I'm Dean Payne, and we are
the Retro Computer Museum.
Next year, March 2018, the Home Computer Museum will be open in Helmond, the Netherlands.
Me and some friends even visiting the Amiga 30 in Mountain View, California, because why not? And then to England, Germany, and everywhere was like crazy.
I'm that passionate about Commodore and Amiga that I engraved my iPhone with the Amiga logo.
We're currently in Cardiff, in Wales, attending the Aon DEFCON 2017.
I'm hopeful that the work we're doing and the work the community is doing as a whole will ensure the future of the Amiga for the next 10, 20, 30 years. And I'm going to make sure that my grandson knows about Amiga and actually will have his own.
I'm here at Revival 2017, the Rivals, with that Dave Perry from Games Master on stage behind me.
I went on to the television shows and began doing TV, and to this day the Commodore Amiga is still my favourite gaming machine.
My time with the Commodore 64 was usually at my friend's house. I used to go over there every day, every weekend, play some games.
There was this lovely shiny beige bread bin sitting on the table with a few games. How little they knew what was going to happen for the next 30 years hence.
This is the 1541 Ultimate 2. What you can do with this is you can connect an SD card or a USB flash drive to load Commodore 64 games.
Yeah, I think right now we're looking at about 4,000 Ultimate 2s that are now in the field, so that's quite many.
They wanted to spend their 50p's and £2 and £3, whatever, I can't remember how much these games were, and they wanted to make this device do something. So that doesn't exist today.
I got my first Commodore 64, and it was the first release of the 64C, so I had the slimline model to begin with. That slimline model I still have, and it still works to this day.
64 Bytes is a series of short videos released weekly that introduce various aspects of programming Commodore 64.
I keep the actual C64 here for occasional testing, even though I do most of my development on the modern computer. And I keep this old TV here because it actually has a really blurry picture. And so it's actually helped me redefine some of the graphics a little bit to make them a little easier to view.
This is where Mega comes in. This is the original C65, as mentioned, the one the Zediago demo was coded on. And this is what we have made. It's basically the same.
Hey everybody, Zach Weddington here, director of Viva Amiga, and I am on the set of the Commodore Story.
Billion to nothing in just about 3. That's a strange kind of genius, that Mehdi Ali. Because that was a $1 billion company, 3 years, down the tubes to nothing.
We are looking back on the retro scene from the technology of 30 years ago, but even today, the technology of tomorrow is being developed, and they're using the Amiga technology.
And yeah, I'm sat here with my Amiga Pi, which I built.
It just shows you that what they did really was truly something very special.
Don't want some, person walking down the street with an Atari T-shirt and, breaking into a fight with someone with a Commodore T-shirt. That would be bad.
Jackbusters, who are you going to call? Is a original Amiga T-shirt, very rare. This is actually from Workbench 2.0. Computer people at that time were, had a bad sense of humor. This is the famous Commodore supports its floppies.
So that trip that I mentioned, the 60th anniversary of the Clearing the Lodge Get Out. So there were my parents, my aunt and uncle, one of my mother's sisters and her husband, and a bunch of that generation's kids, and then that generation's kids. And there's a wonderful picture of us taken in Birkenau at the end of the railway line.
I am here at the National Museum of Computing, which is located in the historic Block H of Bletchley Park. So behind me is the Harwell Decatron, its original name. It is now the world's oldest working computer.
I'll be building a computer museum in my office. In the second story of my office, there's a platform that will have a Commodore 64 running those games and several Amigas. I still have the original Amiga 1000 that I did all the graphics for Defender of the Crown on, and it still works fine. And it's all the monitors and everything that go with it. I've got CD32s, I've got CD-TVs, I've got Amiga 4000, Amiga 2000s, just everything. And so those will be lined up with all of their monitors running in my little computer museum. So I can, anytime I want a bit of nostalgia, I can just go up to the second story and take a look at that.
Commodore indeed was a pioneering company and changed many, many lives, including mine. The retro scene over the last few years seems to be growing and growing. And, all I want to say is you should embrace your inner 8-bit and 16-bit passion and continue on the retro ride.
I'd like to dedicate this to my mom. Without her, I wouldn't be here today.